Hi, my name's Pauline and I'm from Salute, which stands for Save a Life, Understand Trauma Experiences. And I'm a trauma therapist. And in this presentation, we're going to see how trauma has a massive impact on mental health. The first thing I did was looked at what they're saying trauma is. And it seemed to be saying trauma was PTSD. So as a society, we seem to have a limited view of trauma, assuming real emotional damage can only happen in a war zone or extreme violence. But we're changing because PTSD is not the only forms of trauma. Going through a traumatic event, especially if it happens during childhood, rises your chances of a wide range of mental health issues. Studies have shown that most people who seek inpatient with personality disorder, substance abuse, eating disorders, anxiety or depression were exposed to some type of trauma, like a physical, sexual or emotional abuse when they were children. Again, not everybody who goes through trauma, even during childhood, will have these seriously long-lasting consequences, but it is possible. Interpersonal trauma is still trauma. Interpersonal trauma can be defined as any of the following traumatic experiences: a death of a loved one, a divorce, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse in childhood or adult, car accidents, assaults. Childhood interpersonal trauma and its repercussions in adulthood. These include anxiety disorders, depression, personality disorders, substance misuse, eating disorders, suicidal behaviours, PTSD, etc. So what is real trauma? It's when one's capability to cope is overwhelmed. An emotional shock followed by a stressful event or a physical injury. A deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Any negative life event that occurs in a position of relatively helplessness. These are types of trauma: bullying, early childhood trauma, community violence, complex trauma, domestic violence, medical trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, traumatic grief, secondary trauma, media trauma, disasters, refugee trauma, terrorism and violence. These can go into subcategories like macro trauma, dissociation trauma, development trauma, event trauma, acute trauma, chronic trauma, macro trauma. Trauma reactions. Trauma can happen from one large event to several small events. We all react to trauma in different ways, experience a wide range of physical and emotional reactions. There is no right or wrong way to think, feel or respond, so don't judge your own reactions to those of other people. Your responses are normal reactions to abnormal events. Emotional and physical symptoms. Emotional symptoms: shock, denial, disbelief, confusion, difficulty concentrating, anger, irritability, mood swings, anxiety and fear, guilt, shame, self-blame, withdrawing from others, feeling sad and helpless, feeling disconnected or numb. The physical symptoms: insomnia, nightmares, fatigue, being startled easily, difficulty concentrating, racing heartbeats, aches, pains and muscle tension. So you can see there's a lot more emotional symptoms in trauma. Healing from trauma. Trauma symptoms typically last for a few days to a few months, gradually fading as you process the unsettled event. But even when you're feeling better, you may be troubled from time to time with painful memories and emotions, especially in response to triggers such as anniversary of the event or something that reminds you of that trauma. This means the trauma is not fully processed. And unprocessed trauma. Unprocessed memory holds fragments of trauma, like sound, smell, colour, physical sensations, emotions. They are all registered. The brain can capitalize it in the memory in order to survive, keeping it held from the rest of the brain. This is called disassociation. One thing that's blocked in traumatized people is their imagination. It leaves people with a loss of mental flexibility. Imagination gives us opportunity to envision new possibilities for making our dreams come true. It fires our creativity, relieves our boredom, alleviates our pain, enhances our pleasures, and enriches our relationships. Without imagination, it is harder to envision a better future. And unprocessed trauma comes alive with trigger points. That number in itself is very hard to process. It's 1 million multiplied by 1 billion equals 1 quadrillion. And they say that's how many synaptic connections there are in the brain. Some say there are even more than the stars in the universe. When we get traumatized, the brain's capability to process the traumatic experience breaks down. The traumatic experience is not fully processed in the brain, but in the subcortical brain, the part of the brain that has no language, no thought, no time. So what happens is pieces of that trauma are left unprocessed in the subcortical brain. So when you see it, hear it, or smell it, you actually feel like you're back in that situation with the same feelings and emotions. Trauma experts. Many experts in the area of trauma treatment believe that when overwhelmed by something traumatic or deeply distressing, the emotional change or memory from that event becomes stored and trapped in our body. We're often unaware that this has even occurred, but our brain is altered as a result. It can cause problems on all levels, emotionally, mentally, and physically. Emotions are triggered with trauma memory. Trauma affects the entire human organism, the body, the mind, and the brain. Why do we feel it in the body? When the brain experiences an event with a combination of negative consequences and the state of helplessness, it turns on the survival fight reaction, which are sent throughout our body. The part of the brain that controls all your survival instinct, the automatic nerve system. So it also controls every system in your body, including your nervous system, your cardiac system, your respiratory system, digestive system, your muscular and skeletal system. Every system in your body can be affected by trauma event. Trauma is not a story about something that happened long ago. The emotions and physical sensation, the imprints, including images of trauma on the mind-brain, continue to be experienced in the present, not as a memory, but as a disruptive physical and emotional reaction. So it's a classical case of psychology and biology, because we're not just dealing with memory, but the emotions and the feelings that are connected throughout the body. This is a picture of a brain scan when somebody was asked to think of their trauma that had happened to them 13 years earlier. And as you can see in the picture, the brain shows murky, decreased activation in the speech center in the frontal lobe. So even years later, traumatized people often have enormous difficulty telling other people what has happened to them. Traumatized people learn to tell a story so they can suppress their emotions. Trauma location. When a person gets traumatized, they get traumatized not in the neocortex, because the neocortex has language, thought, and content. It's underneath the neocortex, in the subcortex, where the trauma is experienced. In order for psychotherapists to be successful in working with trauma, they have to be able to access the part of the brain that don't have language, don't have thought, but come primarily from intuition, from emotions and body experience. Cause and risk factors. While most mental health illnesses have no defined or single cause, trauma can almost always be traced to one or more traumatic experience. Neglect, losing a loved one, abuse, witnessing violence, bad childhood experiences, etc. Not everyone who experiences trauma will develop a trauma disorder. Two people may experience or witness the same trauma and only one develop this disorder, while the other doesn't. Why this happens is not fully understood, but there are risk factors that make some people more prone to trauma disorders, like having experienced trauma previously, especially in childhood. It's like a re-traumatization. Experienced multiple stressful events at the same time, having another mental illness, misuse of substance, lacking good social support, and a family history of mental health of any type. Substance misuse. Having a trauma disorder may increase the risk of having a substance misuse disorder. Someone with a trauma disorder, especially when it's undiagnosed or untreated, may turn to drug and alcohol to self-medicate and escape from negative feelings. This can lead to substance misuse being a coping mechanism. Suicide. Experiencing trauma and being unable to cope with it in a healthy way may also influence someone to suicide. Anyone with trauma disorders may be vulnerable to suicide thoughts, but those with severe symptoms or who are not receiving treatment may be at the greater risk. Trauma can affect life. Trauma disorders can also cause serious complications in all areas of a person's life. These may include damage and difficulty in relationships, difficulty at work or school, loss of jobs, financial problems, isolation, loneliness, insomnia, injury from impulse behaviours and angry outbursts, and of course legal troubles. Trauma trigger examples. Trauma disorders are mental health conditions that are caused by a traumatic experience. Trauma is subjective, but common examples that may trigger a disorder include abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, losing a loved one, or being in a natural disaster. Trauma can cause extreme fear, anxiety, depression, outbursts, flashbacks, and other symptoms that can cause significant impairment. Trauma can be treated and symptoms managed with certain types of therapy and medication. These are types of mental health conditions that we have today. Here's them continued. Now, if we do a percentage, counting all of them, so there's 32, we literally get 82% are trauma-based. However, if we take away the ones highlighted in red, like premenstrual tension or SAD, because they're not trauma-based, and did a calculation, we get it to 96.5%, and that's because we half drug and alcohol, case of 50% tried it and just became dependent, and 50% case of them blocking out trauma. So 96% are trauma-based. So it makes us want to ask a question. Are we treating the trauma, or are we treating the condition, the diagnosis? Trauma can be the root cause for most mental health illnesses. This plant looks okay. We keep watering it, hoping it's going to flourish. But the roots are pot-bound, getting no goodness. This we can't always see. If we don't repot it and address the root cause and give the roots room to grow, it might not survive. So if trauma can be the root cause for most mental health illnesses, makes us ask another question. What if we change one word? What if we didn't call it mental health, but trauma health? Would it help people get better quicker, knowing they've got a trauma issue to be dealing with? Would it help on job application forms? I have mental health or I have a trauma issue. Would it be more friendly or accepted? Would it remove the stigma of mental health conditions? Would it stop people using their conditions as a means for their behaviour? Would it be helping that person move on by treating the root cause? Would it free up the backlog of people waiting for treatment? Would it save money on prescription drugs? And would it save money on resources in dealing with returning clients? We don't know, that's why we're asking the question. What we do know, however, trauma is treatable, because we at Salute, we use BSP. And it's a brain and body based therapy using bioelectrical sound that allows us access to the root cause of the trauma, because it bypasses the thinking brain to gain access to the trauma. It treats emotions, feelings, mind, body, and brain. This is an holistic therapy treating the whole person. BSP, or brain spotting, is a treatment that works with other treatments as well as on its own. And BSP was founded by Dr. David Grand. It's been going since 2003, used in Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, Manchester bombing, as well as with war veterans. It's worldwide treatment taught in over 37 countries, and there's other treatments out there that actually tackle the trauma and the emotions, which is the root cause. I'd like to say thank you for listening. Any questions, you can drop them in the link below. Thank you so much.